Coker is a healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape.
Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you all for tuning in. Today's conversation, we're going to jump right in. We had another remote recording as has become the norm during the shutdown and work from home nature of COVID-19. But today we're talking with Alex Kirkland and Justin Chamblee, both regulars on the podcast in past episodes. And we're talking specifically about the impact of COVID-19, but specifically on ACOs and CINs. Obviously, a lot of discussion out there in the marketplace and feedback from our clients. We really wanted to start getting away from the discussion around how's everybody responding to COVID-19 and start thinking about more or talking more about how we're planning for the future and this new normal. And so Justin and Alex had some, I think, some great commentary around kind of some of the feedback that we're hearing and some of the things that we're seeing out there in the industry. So, and we talked about things specifically. Alex covers the 5 interim rules and waivers that CMS released around Medicare shared savings programs and the impact on other kind of alternative payment models and those types of arrangements. So there's a lot there that is relevant very much today, but it's very pertinent as well as kind of planning for the future, or as it relates to risk and managing risk and predicting kind of future risk and value-based models and those types of things. All of those come into play in this discussion. And Alex and Justin, I think, summed it up pretty well. There's a lot there. We probably could have spent easily an hour on a number of different points. So I'm sure we'll have a good bit of follow-up discussion around this. Obviously, we'll continue to monitor it and continue the discussion as things continue to unfold. So we hope this is beneficial for you all. We'd love to hear your feedback and have suggestions around anything you'd like us to drill down into more detailed discussion, any additional information you like, any questions that come about from this discussion. Don't hesitate to reach out to us. As always, you can find not only this podcast, but all of our podcast episodes on our website at coffeewithcoker.com, as well as through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to hear feedback, questions, suggestions for future topics. Thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy this conversation with Justin and Alex. All right, well, welcome back to Coffee with Coker, and we have a couple folks here that have been regulars on the podcast in the past. And as mentioned in the intro, we have Justin Chamblee and Alex Kirkland joining us today. We're talking about the impact and what we're seeing as far as dealing with COVID-19 and kind of the future environment or some things to look ahead, but specifically for ACOs and CINs. Obviously, we work with a lot of ACOs, CINs, a lot of health systems that have those types of entities. You know, there's some unique things going on that folks can at least be thinking about, be aware of, and hopefully be able to kind of prepare for as we continue to move through this very unique time. As we dive into the discussion, I think it may be helpful for us to start at kind of a high level, just some general comments. And Justin, I'll maybe let you jump in first here, but generally, what are we hearing from clients, and as far as kind of the general response to what's been happening with COVID-19 now that we're 2 months in as we're recording this, and then specifically to some of the ACO CINs that you work with, what are some things you're hearing?
Yeah, great question, Mark. And we've been very busy over the last couple of months dealing with clients and very acute issues tied to COVID-19. One of my core focal points is on provider compensation. So a lot of the issues that I've been dealing with have been in that realm, which leads to just basic compensation arrangements, but also items like ACO and CIN participation and the resultant distribution strategies there. And there's a lot of questions as to what the future looks like. We've been dealing a lot over the last couple of weeks and months with just the basic compensation models, trying to help organizations navigate that, especially when inpatient volume is down, overall finances are suffering, and at the same time, physicians aren't doing much work in terms of elective procedures. And so putting stopgaps in place to start to address some of that has been a core focus. But we've also seen a lot of activity trying to, for lack of better terms, predict the future. I mean, if you think about ACOs and CINs that are all tied to the generation of savings, with some of them being upside only, but others being upside and downside, the current dynamic in the environment is having a massive impact on how those entities are performing. And the true impact of that is still to be determined.
Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. Right now, we've obviously been talking a lot about, what we're doing to deal with things in the midst of this pandemic and the shutdowns, the drop in production as a result of less elective procedures and so on. So I think, but now we're starting to kind of get to this point. It feels like where we're starting to think about, all right, what is the new normal, quote unquote, going to ultimately look like? And I know there's a lot to unpack there when we talk about physician compensation, but I know comp is going to be at the forefront of that as we try to think about what the future holds. Let's talk about, since you teed up some of the things around the importance of savings, shared savings for ACOs and CINs, those types of organizations, and the correlation with physician compensation. Let's start with, and Alex, maybe you can jump in here, talk about some of the rules and interim rules that we're seeing right now, kind of in the midst of things, even some of the waivers that are out there, other changes as relate to different payment models, et cetera.
Thanks, Mark. And just to comment on what Justin was saying, as far as the uncertainty, Justin and I were working with a client trying to forecast how their volumes may or may not return over the back half of this year. And I think where we can get guidance from on these rules is that it helps us understand, how policymakers are thinking about shaping things to influence these uncertain times. So to backtrack a little bit, I think, as this began in the March timeframe, we really think back, fears were mounting. ACO leaders began to contemplate how this would affect their performance from a financial perspective. Among other concerns, they were worried about whether or not they were going to have to fully absorb the risk of this crisis, and grew more uncomfortable with the benchmark measurements for which their losses or savings would be tied against. In 2020, there are 192 risk-bearing Medicare ACOs. And the National Association of ACOs, they conducted a survey in April that nearly 3/5 of these would consider dropping out of the Medicare Shared Savings Program if there were no action taken and they were going to be on the hook for these COVID costs, which they could do by May 31st with no penalty. In response to that, there's been a lot of industry-wide advocacy to making changes to these ACO performance measurements, those methodologies and how they'll be measured for this performance year. And then we saw CMS release their interim rule on April 30th that gave a good bit of attention to the Medicare Shared Savings Program in order to provide some financial shelter to these ACOs. In it, there's 5 distinct policy changes related to the Medicare Shared Savings Program. And I thought it may be helpful if I just kind of go through those and speak about the implications.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, number one, they will allow ACOs whose current agreement periods expire on December 31st of this year, 2020, the option to extend their existing agreement period by 1 year. Thus, they're not going to commit themselves for an extended period, gives them an opportunity to gain clarity around what this performance will look like. Number two, the second policy change is that they'll allow ACOs in the basic tracks glide path of the Medicare Shared Savings Program the option to elect to maintain their current level of participation in the next performance year, 2021. So CMS is being gentler with the stick that's pushing ACOs towards risk. They're trying to maintain the momentum they've built within this program. The third policy change in this interim final rule is that COVID-19 now qualifies as an extreme and uncontrollable circumstance, so that shared losses can be mitigated under precedent that's already been set. In December 17, there was a rule that was passed that considered extreme and uncontrollable circumstances for the Medicare Shared Savings Program. And it was designed to address things such as hurricanes and wildfires. But now this is a triggering event that would now qualify as one of those extreme and uncontrollable circumstances. For other payer contracts, there may be force majeure clauses that qualify COVID towards that uncontrollable circumstance language. That's to be seen and addressed on a case-by-case basis. It did take CMS until December 17 to kind of put something like this in place. So it's likely that there may be limited clauses in other payer contracts for this. But getting back to the policy changes within the rule, the fourth one was to adjust historical benchmarks in performance calculations so that ACOs will not have COVID-19 costs counted against them. Which this is so important because it lessens the financial risk of these risk-bearing ACOs. Very important because Medicare Shared Savings Program is the largest value-based contracting vehicle in existence. It was implemented during the Bush administration, and so it has seen advancement over, a decade of being in existence. And so lawmakers and health officials are very invested in the program's continued success, and to be able to use this as a continued vehicle to spur the entire industry towards value-based payment. I think this policy change is the key thing that ACOs leadership needs to see so that they will remain active and maintain the viability of the Medicare Shared Savings Program. The fifth and final policy change that this interim final rule established was the expansion of the definition of primary care services for the purposes of determining beneficiary assignment, so that it will include telehealth codes for virtual check-ins, e-visits, and telehealth. This is important because it'll help ACOs cast a larger net of patients so they can grow their attribution so that it will include more Medicare beneficiaries in the future. How volume has been so important within these practices. But if you think about these shared savings arrangements and the program and other contracts that ACOs and CINs have, being able to have a large patient base, that you can target for these programs will be key. So these telehealth services are very instrumental in driving that. And then I think it's also an interesting policy change they made because we saw that COVID-19 served as the tipping point for telehealth. And so they're just reinforcing that. Now patients are going to change the way that they're consuming healthcare to be more telehealth based, more virtual care centered. And so these policy changes are helping reinforce that, yes, this is going to be a continued way of delivering healthcare.
I think that's a great point. All of those rules, I think, are extremely relevant for those ACOs and CINs out there. But the last point on telehealth is something that we at Coker, we've been monitoring and commenting on and doing work around for a while now, but particularly here since things really started to change back in March. And I think we saw even from, we did a survey amongst our clients regarding telehealth. And we saw some responses and statistics that were consistent with your comments, Alex. As we think about the ruling that they made around extreme and uncontrollable circumstances, it seems kind of fortuitous. And I know you said it was designed more to respond to things like natural disasters, et cetera. But the fact that they just did that a few years ago, I think is kind of interesting. But where have we seen this in the past? I'm just curious. And what does some of this past experience as far as waivers and stopgaps, interim changes that they've made in the past, what does that tell us as far as thinking about the future? Any comments there?
This is Justin. I'll comment real fast. I think when ACOs were being put into existence, they were not thinking about the allocation of risk and the derivation of shared savings in the context of COVID-19. And I think we're truly dealing with something that is completely novel and unanticipated relative to what is possible and the possibilities that can affect cost. And so I think the impact that this may have is the willingness for providers to take on risk. And to the extent they do take on risk, I think it will affect the contracting provisions in terms of whether it's tied into the force majeure clauses or elsewhere, the means by which they will try to shed specific risk, i.e. pandemic-related risk. I also think it may change the dynamic of reinsurance, meaning organizations that are taking on risk, I think will be much more apt to go and become reinsured, or at least have some kind of stopgap reinsurance policy, so that then their risk is limited to a tolerable amount. But I think big picture about health systems right now who are seeing legitimately 40% plus decreases in their respective volume, if they are also in risk-based vehicles through the MSSP or through other commercial initiatives, the idea of having to pay back money due to risk on top of the massive losses that they're already experiencing adds insult to injury. And so I think you will see organizations trying to mitigate that risk in some way going forward.
Yeah, I mean, let's face it, everybody's appetite for risk increases when things are great, right? And then when things start to kind of get a little crunched, that risk appetite definitely changes. So I think that tells us a lot about not only the past, but looking to the future.
Yeah, I think one way that we may see that take place is within these shared savings contracts, or even CINs that are serving self-insured populations. There may be more and more definition around high cost cases and how those may be excluded from or adjusted to some degree from benchmark calculations. I think we'll see more and more thought in that area from policymakers in the future, and then other payers will follow suit, and we'll see that the maturation of that be much more relevant and important going forward.
Yeah. Any comments as far as just others that were out there in the marketplace that we're hearing kind of different degrees of buzz and commentary, references as far as what this could look like from in the future, as far as other people's perspectives from those in the industry?
We're working with a pretty large ACO right now, and had an opportunity to talk with their leadership just last week and asked them where they stood in terms of, are you considering dropping out or not? And their answer was, no, they're not going to drop out. They're going to move forward, but they are very concerned about the calculation of cost. And so this interim final rule, it provides a lot of assurances on those types of costs being carved out. Organizations need to start to understand what that looks like and forecast out what their cost profiles may entail.
One thing that's interesting is, there's so much guidance out there as to what CMS is doing relative to MSSP programs, but there are numerous commercial programs out there that include risk. And I can't speak specifically to it, but I question, how flexible some of those commercial vehicles are being relative to COVID-19. And, are they putting stopgap measures in place to at least balance out the impact of COVID-19? So I think entities, definitely are having to wade through those waters right now, much more so than they ever anticipated when they had this idea to take on a risk. And I think that the biggest concern, and it's good, Alex, as you mentioned, that a client was thinking about staying within or in the MSSP, but I think the biggest concern I have is how detrimental will the current environment be on the long-term pathway to balancing volume and value, because I think we can all agree that finding a happy balance is needed. Yet, I think this just continues to reinforce that it is not an easy transition.
That's a great segue, actually, because I want to get y'all's feedback on talking about the impact of all of this that's happening, these changes, and kind of what we're looking at in the future, specifically on some of these more value-based strategies. And so when we think about ACOs or CINs, similar types of organizations taking on risk, from a accounting perspective, as we think about the benchmarks, you mentioned, I think, Alex, you mentioned the calculation of cost, concern around that. Any comments there?
Yeah, Mark, interesting question. And obviously, I think we're sitting in a large unknown here. I mean, I don't think anybody knows how big of a financial impact in terms of the calculation of savings, the impact on cost of care COVID-19 is going to have. I mean, if you think about a typical ACO right now, they've got a population of patients who have COVID-19, who I have to imagine the costs of care are through the roof for those hospitalized on a ventilator, which obviously throws costs out of whack. Yet at the same time, you have this massive population of patients that, for all intents and purposes, probably have had and experienced less care over the last few months than they have in the past, in terms of the fact that elective procedures aren't occurring. They're likely less apt to go to the hospital. If they are having medical visits, they're likely being done via telehealth, which is obviously a lower cost or means of getting care than going into the office. So you have all these things that are also at the same time lowering the cost of care, presumably. And what I sit here and think about is, will we see this short-term gain, meaning potentially in some areas cost savings, but at the same time, a lot of these patients who may not be receiving the care that they need, what does that mean for their future health? Meaning, if they're not getting good preventative care now, are they going to have even larger issues later on? So for the population of non-COVID patients, are we going to see short-term gain for long-term pain? And I think that's where only time will tell.
Yeah, I think that sums it up well. What about, I'm curious, those capitated or capitation-like models that are still out there or have kind of even some have reemerged over the last couple of years. How have they fared through all of this?
Well, capitation may be the secret formula because fee-for-service payments, they constrain providers to services tied to a specific set of payment codes and that associated volume. Prospective payment allows providers the flexibility of using any modality possible to take care of the patient, including telehealth, those follow-up phone calls. So as we've seen volumes decline, and I think there's studies out there that volumes have fallen by an average of 60%, that shifting to capitated models that have a guaranteed revenue stream may be a viable, not alternative during a crisis, but something that needs to be considered in terms of your contracting strategy. Now capitation does require efficiency in it, but it also may encourage investment in the social determinants of health, other factors that are tied to a person's healthcare outcome. So I think that's an area that organizations may look toward, and we'll see more and more growth of that. Hopefully, as these models continue to thrive.
And if you think about capitation, I mean, through the crisis where volumes went to nil, capitation would have still provided a steady stream of income. I think the question would have been, when the actuaries are reconciling the capitation payments with the cost of care on the back end, how do they line up, and how does that affect future capitation payments? So, it's an interesting phenomenon. But as Alex, you said, I think it's a model that requires more consideration in light of COVID-19.
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back to risk appetite, right? I mean, the appetite for risk always change depending on the broader context of the market. So it's probably not surprising that people are going to start to move towards protection, risk protection, and capitation may be one of those options, as well as other options. As we think about, and we kind of come full circle here, I just wanted to kind of throw it out to both of you guys and get your input on working with clients, working with these organizations, whether it's a CIN, ACO, and others that are similar, all going through very similar, or working to navigate similar challenges. What do we think as far as looking to the future, preparing? What do they do? What can they do? What can they be thinking about now as far as responding to and preparing for all these things that we've seen, all these things we just talked about, and maybe some of the things that could be coming around the curve? Any just kind of closing thoughts there?
I think that you want to have as many patients in these models as you can, right? You want to grow your base. And so thinking about your primary care strategy, how much of that revenue is on these prospective capitated models will be a very important consideration factor. And we've worked with groups, Justin and I, both in the physician compensation space, we work with groups to establish structures that allow these groups to compensate their providers for value-based performance. I think the groups that have set that up, they are better acclimated to respond to these policy changes, as they have a mechanism in place where they do have value-based performance ingrained within their compensation model, and their focus may be on how much of a percentage to allot toward that type of component within the structure, versus the group that has not gone down that path. They would have more legwork. They would have to do some more work to set up a structure, put that in place, and all the efforts that accompany that.
Yeah, I also think I saw an interesting article the other day that was talking about how this was going to move organizations to change their physician compensation incentives further away from volume. And I can appreciate where a physician would want that in the context of the fact that under a work RV-based model with no guarantee, let's say, COVID-19 has been negatively affecting them by nature of the fact that they can't generate an income. Yet hospitals at the same time are dealing with massive shortfalls. And so the last thing I think a hospital would be willing to do is to go put a physician on further guaranteed pay with very little volume incentives and only value incentives. And so I think long-term volume is still going to be very much in vogue and very much applicable. And I think organizations are going to continue to work to find the right balance between volume and value. But I do not by any means see the volume elements going away. In fact, I could see health systems revisiting how much guaranteed pay they provide physicians solely as a means of balancing the allocation of risk. So I do see that playing into the equation. And just generally speaking, as we talked about previously, I think the assessment of how much risk an organization is willing to take on will be key, whether that is through typical physician compensation arrangements, whether that's through commercial shared savings or shared risk models in CINs, or whether it's through the NSSP program. I think risk will be the name of the game, and trying to find the happy balance there.
Yeah, I think what's interesting there is we've learned very quickly that even though it's kind of an obvious statement, but sometimes we miss it. In order to achieve value, you still actually need volume. And when volume goes away, it's hard to achieve either. And I think your comments there, Justin, are interesting too, because I know we've had kind of an internal discussion around what is going to happen with guaranteed compensation versus risk-based versus some sort of balance. And, this isn't the discussion for today, but I think in closing, if we think about stepping away for a second from health systems, CINs, ACOs, et cetera, thinking about private practice, the risk there, I mean, this is a whole other discussion, but the risk there is I think, as you put it, holistically different. And, I think that's something that we have to look at too, and thinking about the future. Well, good. Any other comments in closing?
No, I think it's an interesting discussion, and I am interested to see, number one, the additional actions CMS takes to keep people in MSSPs, and also I will be interested to see the results. I mean, we're a long way from seeing those results, but I'll be interested to see the results and what influence that has on the overall pathway from volume to value.
Yeah, I think just my closing comment is that there's been so much time and investment in specifically the Medicare Shared Savings Program, that I think there is a very large interest to see its continued success. And so, to the extent that policymakers, healthcare officials can do so, they'll listen to that industry-wide advocacy to make that happen.
Absolutely. Well, that's great. I appreciate y'all's comments and input here. I know this is something that is absolutely relevant to very many of our clients and many organizations out there. So this is going to be something that we continue to monitor and comment on and work on as we all collectively kind of navigate this, this quote unquote new normal. So thank you all for your input.
Absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them, and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.